The wind was a blade, sharp and relentless, honing itself on the jagged peaks of the Laramie Range before descending upon the plains. It drove the snow not down, but sideways, a blinding, churning river of white that erased the world. For Eli Granger, it was just weather. He leaned into it, his shoulders set, the brim of his hat pulled low. His horse, Jed, a sturdy buckskin that knew this land as well as he did, plodded onward with a faith born of routine. They were on the last mile home. The supplies for the widow Miller had been delivered. He'd restocked her woodpile, checked the seals on her windows, and left without waiting for the stuttered thanks he knew she'd offer. Words were a currency he rarely dealt in. Actions were solid. They could be measured, trusted. You could build a life on what a man did, not on what he said. He had learned that lesson hard, learned it in a way that had scoured him clean of pleasantries and left only a quiet, unyielding core. His cabin was little more than a dark speck against the vast emptiness, a lonely outpost on the edge of a town that barely tolerated his existence. He was a known man, but not a known soul. They knew of his strength, of the time he'd faced down 3 drunken Union Pacific men over a stolen horse and hadn't needed to draw his gun. They knew of his justice, of the way he'd tracked a lost child for 2 days through a blizzard just like this one and brought him back, wrapped in his own coat. And they knew of his silence, a thing so profound it was like a wall around him, a stillness that made other men uneasy. He lived alone because he preferred it. The quiet of the plains was a balm compared to the noise inside his own head. Here, the only ghosts were the ones he brought with him, and they were familiar company. It was Jed who stopped first, his ears twitching, his head low. Eli reined him in, his eyes scanning the landscape. The snow made phantoms of everything, turning familiar rocks and sagebrush into hunched, waiting figures. Then he saw it, a dark mound near the road, half buried already, a stain against the purity of the drifts. It was too small for a fallen buffalo, too misshapen for a dead deer. He dismounted, the snow crunching under his boots, the wind tearing at his coat. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a person, a woman. She was lying on her side, curled into a useless ball against the impossible cold. Her dress was a thin, dark calico, torn at the shoulder and wholly inadequate for the weather. It was the kind of dress a woman might wear indoors, not out in the fury of a Wyoming winter. One of her arms was thrown over her head as if to shield her from a blow, and her dark hair was matted with ice. But it was her feet that held his gaze. They were bare, blue-white against the snow, stripped of all protection. A thin line of frozen blood traced a path from her ankle up her calf, stark and vivid. Eli knelt, his movements economical, wasting no energy. He brushed the snow from her face. She was young, her features fine-boned and pale as porcelain, save for the dark, ugly bruise that bloomed across her cheekbone. Her lips were cracked and tinged with blue. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of her neck, under her jaw. He waited, holding his breath against the wind. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, a flutter, a weak, thready pulse, a fragile signal of life refusing to be extinguished. He didn't ponder the why of her. He didn't wonder who she was or what had brought her to this desperate state. Such questions were luxuries for a warmer room, for a safer time. Out here, there was only one question: live or die? Without a word, he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of flour, a thing of brittle bones and frozen flesh. He carried her to Jed, who stood patient and unmoving. Arranging her limp body across the saddle was an awkward task, but he managed it, settling her in front of him before mounting. He wrapped one arm around her waist, pulling her back against his chest to shield her from the wind, and wrapped the reins around his other hand. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her cold seeping through his thick wool coat, a chilling reminder of how close she was to the edge. He nudged Jed into motion. The cabin was close now, its chimney a thin gray line against the swirling snow. It wasn't a home, not really. It was a shelter. And right now, that was all that mattered. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth had burned down to glowing embers. The single room was filled with the familiar smells of wood smoke, leather, and coffee. It was a man's space, sparse and orderly. A narrow bed pushed against one wall, a rough-hewn table with a single chair, and shelves holding tins of beans, flour, and coffee. His rifle rested on pegs above the door. He laid the woman gently on the braided rug before the hearth, her body looking unnervingly small in the dim light. He worked quickly, his hands sure and practiced. He stoked the embers, adding kindling and then larger logs until a proper fire roared to life, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket and set it on a hook over the flames. While the water heated, he examined her. The cut on her ankle was deep, a nasty gash from a sharp rock or a piece of glass. It was dirty and inflamed. He found his supplies, a small wooden box containing carbolic soap, clean rags, and a jar of salve. He carefully washed the wound, his touch firm but gentle, his focus absolute. He saw other marks on her skin, older, fading bruises on her arms, the shape of fingers. He saw the raw, chafed skin on her wrists. He noted them, filed them away, but his expression remained unchanged. Her past was a story written on her body, but it was not his place to read it aloud. He cleaned the wound, applied the salve, and wrapped her ankle tightly with a strip of clean linen. He pulled a thick wool blanket from his bed and covered her, tucking it in around her small frame. Then he sat back on his heels, watching. The firelight played over her face, softening the harsh lines of the bruise. In sleep, she looked less like a victim and more like a girl who had run a long, hard way from something terrible. He made a thin broth, letting it simmer while he waited. The storm howled outside, a wild beast trying to claw its way in, but the cabin was steadfast. It was his fortress of solitude, and now it held a stranger. Hours passed. The sky outside darkened from gray to black. He sat in the lone chair, watching her breathe. The rise and fall of the blanket was the only movement in the room, a quiet rhythm that was somehow more profound than the storm's rage. She woke with a gasp, a choked, terrified sound. Her eyes flew open, wide and dark with panic. They darted around the unfamiliar room, taking in the log walls, the fire, and finally, him. She flinched, scrambling backward on the rug, her hands coming up to shield herself. Her whole body coiled like a cornered animal. "Who are you? Where am I?" Her voice was a raw whisper. Eli didn't move from his chair. He knew that any sudden motion, any attempt to comfort, would only frighten her more. He had seen that kind of fear in spooked horses and trapped coyotes. It was a fear that lived in the bone, a fear that reason couldn't touch. He simply met her gaze, his own eyes calm and steady. He picked up the bowl of broth from the hearth where it had been keeping warm, along with a piece of bread. He rose slowly, deliberately, and walked toward her. She shrank back further, pressing herself against the stone of the hearth. He didn't stop until he was close enough to set the bowl down on the floor, well within her reach, but not so close as to crowd her. Then he turned his back on her and walked over to the cabin door, busying himself with checking the latch. He gave her silence. He gave her space. He heard the scrape of the bowl on the floorboards, then the quiet sound of her sipping the broth. He didn't turn around. He stayed by the door, a silent sentinel, letting her eat in peace. When he finally glanced back, the bowl was empty. She was huddled under the blanket again, her eyes watching his every move, still wary, but the frantic terror had subsided into a tense watchfulness. "My name is Sarah," she said, her voice a little stronger. The name felt wrong in her mouth, a borrowed coat that didn't quite fit. Eli nodded once, accepting it. He didn't offer his own. She was bruised, cold, and terrified. She volunteered nothing more, and he asked for nothing. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the scream of the wind. When it was time to sleep, he added another log to the fire, ensuring it would burn through the night. He took his spare blanket from a chest at the foot of his bed. Then he picked up his heavy sheepskin coat. She watched him, her brow furrowed in confusion. As he walked to the door, "The bed is yours," he said. It was the first full sentence he had spoken to her. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones rubbing together at the bottom of a river. He didn't wait for a reply. He opened the door, letting in a swirl of snow and a blast of Arctic air, and then closed it firmly behind him. He made his way through the blinding storm to the barn, the cold a familiar, biting companion. He found an empty stall, shook out his blanket over a pile of clean hay, and lay down, his coat pulled up to his chin. The wind found every crack in the barn walls, whistling a lonesome, mournful tune. He closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of the night, a man who had chosen the brutal cold over the warmth of his own bed, all to give a stranger a moment's peace. Over the next few days, the storm locked them in. The world outside was a churning chaos of white, the snow piling in deep drifts against the cabin walls. The wind never ceased its assault, its constant moan a backdrop to the suffocating quiet within. It howled through the skeletal arms of the dead pines that dotted the landscape, a sound of pure desolation that seemed to seep through the very logs of the cabin, mirroring the unspoken loneliness that filled the space between them. For the woman who called herself Sarah, it was a time of watching. She spent most of it huddled in the blanket by the fire, her body slowly knitting itself back together. Her ankle was a dull, throbbing ache, but her strength was returning in small increments. She watched Eli. She watched the way he moved, with a quiet discipline and an economy of motion. He never hurried, yet nothing was left undone. He rose before the sun, made coffee, and went out to tend to Jed, returning with a dusting of snow on his shoulders. He would pass her a steaming mug of coffee without a word. He would check the bandage on her ankle, his touch impersonal and efficient. Before replacing the blanket over her shoulders, he provided for her without ever encroaching, maintaining a respectful distance that was as solid and unbreachable as the cabin walls. One afternoon, while he was outside, her curiosity got the better of her. She hobbled over to a small shelf beside his bed. There lay an old, leather-bound Bible, its cover worn smooth with use. She opened it carefully. Tucked between the pages of the Psalms was a single pressed flower, a wild bluebell. Its color faded, but its shape perfectly preserved. The page beneath it was stained, a dark, rust-colored stain that she knew, instinctively, was old blood. She closed the book gently and put it back, a cold knot forming in her stomach. She didn't ask. She knew he wouldn't explain. The following morning, the storm broke. A weak, watery sun appeared, casting a brilliant, blinding glare across the new-fallen snow. The world was pristine, silent, and cold. Eli took his axe from its place by the door and went out to the woodpile. From the cabin's single window, Sadie watched him. The cold was so sharp, it felt like it could crack stone. Yet he worked with a steady, powerful rhythm. He'd shed his coat and was working in just his union suit. Steam rose from his shoulders with every swing. After a while, he stripped that off too, his torso bare to the frigid air. And she saw them. His back was a landscape of old pain. A web of scars crisscrossed his shoulders and sides. Some were pale, thin lines, but others were different. They were wide, puckered, and unnaturally smooth. Burn scars. They swirled across his skin in ugly patterns, the work of fire. She stared, her breath fogging the window pane. This silent, steady man was no stranger to agony. He carried a history far darker than she could have imagined, a history he kept hidden under his clothes and his silence. For Eli, The physical labor was a release. It was a way to fight back against the memories that ambushed him in the quiet moments. Chopping wood, feeling the satisfying thud of the axe biting deep, was real. It was tangible. It pushed back the ghosts, if only for a little while. But they always returned, a snatch of a woman's laughter, light and free, the scent of lavender. Her voice, clear as a bell, saying his name, Eli. Then the other sounds, a man's cruel shout, the deafening crack of a gunshot. The image that always followed was the worst. Red on white, so much red, spilling across the clean white-painted steps of the town church, staining the hem of a white lace dress. He gritted his teeth and swung the axe harder. The rhythm a prayer, a punishment, a way to forget. That night, a new sound intruded upon the silence, a sound from the wild, the long, haunting howl of a wolf, answered by another, and then another, until a whole chorus filled the night. They sounded close, too close. Sadie's heart hammered against her ribs. She had heard stories of wolf packs, driven by hunger in hard winters, growing bold enough to attack livestock, even people. She crept from the fireside, her bare feet making no sound on the floorboards. She reached for the heavy iron bar used to secure the door, her hands trembling. She stopped. A figure was already there, a tall, broad silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering through the window. It was Eli. He stood as still as a statue, his rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm, his head cocked as he listened to the calls of the wolves. He hadn't made a sound, but he had been there all along, awake and watchful. He was a guardian in the night, a silent protector standing between her and the encroaching darkness. She retreated back to the hearth, her fear slowly receding, replaced by a strange and unfamiliar feeling. In her world, men were the danger. They were the wolves that preyed on the weak. They were the source of bruises and fear, the reason she was here in the first place. But this man, he stood guard against the wolves. He slept in the cold to give her a warm bed. He tended her wounds and fed her without asking for a single thing in return. She was beginning to realize that Eli Granger was not like other men, but the fear, the deeply ingrained lesson that all men were a threat, was a hard one to unlearn. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, watching the unmovable shadow at the door. He was different. Yes, but she was still afraid. The days that followed the storm unfolded in a slow, quiet rhythm, governed by the rising and setting of a pale winter sun. Sadie's body, starved and broken, began to heal. The deep ache in her bones subsided into a dull memory, and the gash on her ankle scabbed over, pulling tight as new skin formed beneath. She graduated from the fireside rug to the cabin's lone chair, and then to taking hesitant steps around the small room. With each passing day, she regained a piece of herself, a small measure of strength she thought had been lost forever in the snow. Her world was the cabin, and its center was Eli Granger. She watched him with an intensity that was part fear, part fascination. His life was a testament to discipline. There were no wasted movements, no idle words. Every action had a purpose. He mended a broken strap on his saddle with meticulous, patient stitches. He cleaned his rifle with a focused calm that was almost unnerving. He cooked their simple meals of salt pork and beans, moving about the small space with an ingrained familiarity, never speaking unless it was absolutely necessary. A clipped, "More coffee?" or a simple, "Eat," was the extent of their conversation. Yet, in his silence, he was more present than any man she had ever known. He continued to provide for her without ever invading her space, keeping a distance that felt less like coldness and more like a profound respect for her privacy. But he noticed everything. He saw the slight shiver that ran through her when the fire died down and would add another log without being asked. He noticed when she dozed off in the chair, her head drooping to one side, and would gently drape a blanket over her shoulders, his touch so light it barely registered. Their bond was forged in these small, wordless moments. It was in the way he passed her a steaming tin cup of coffee in the morning, his calloused fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second, a spark of warmth in the cold air. It was in the shared glance across the table as they ate, a brief acknowledgement of their mutual existence in this isolated pocket of the world. These moments were like tiny, fragile threads, slowly weaving a connection between them in the vast, echoing silence. She never forgot the image of the pressed flower in his Bible, or the dark stain on the page. It was a secret she kept for him, a piece of his history that she held in her mind, and it made his quiet care for her feel all the more significant. One evening, as the fire popped and crackled, casting a warm, flickering glow on the log walls, a strange impulse took hold of her. She needed to give him something, a piece of her own story, however small and ugly. The safety he had built around her felt so foreign, so undeserved, that she had to test it, to see if it would crumble under the weight of her past. "I once worked in a saloon," she said, her voice small and tight in the quiet room. Eli was sharpening a skinning knife by the fire, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound. He didn't stop, but she saw his hands pause for a fraction of a second before resuming their steady motion. She took a shaky breath and continued, the words rushing out of her. "In Laramie, I served drinks, clean tables, that's all." She looked down at her hands, twisting a loose thread on the blanket. "But it was a saloon, and no one ever believed that was all I did." There it was, the shame she had carried for so long, the taint of other people's assumptions. She waited for his reaction, a grunt of disgust, a knowing, cynical look, a coldness in his eyes that would tell her she was no different from what they all thought. He finished sharpening the knife, testing the edge with his thumb. He wiped the blade clean on a piece of leather and stood up. He walked over to the water bucket, took a long drink from the dipper, and then turned to look at her. His face was unreadable in the firelight, his eyes dark pools of shadow. He just nodded, a single, slow nod. That was all. No questions, no judgment, no accusation. In his simple acceptance, he gave her a gift greater than any she had ever received. He gave her back a piece of her own truth. A wave of emotion so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her. For the first time in years, she felt seen. A week after the storm, their supplies began to run low. The snow had been packed down by the wind and sun, making the road to town passable. Eli hitched Jed to a small sleigh and, after leaving a stack of firewood inside for her, left at dawn. Sadie spent the day in a state of nervous agitation. The silence of the cabin felt different without him in it. It was emptier, colder. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. She realized, with a jolt of alarm, how much she had come to depend on his silent, steady presence. The thought was terrifying. Dependence was a trap, a cage she had barely escaped. In town, Eli Granger's appearance at Abernathy's Mercantile caused a minor stir. He was not a man who came to town for idle chatter. He bought what he needed and left. But today, his list was different. Along with the usual flour, coffee, and beans, he bought a length of soft blue wool fabric, thread, and a set of needles. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose curiosity was as vast as the plains, watched with keen interest. "Getting into sewing, Eli?" he asked, a sly grin on his thin face. Eli just looked at him, his gaze flat and expressionless, and laid his money on the counter. He took his parcels and left. The silence he left behind was more potent than any sharp retort. But the seed of rumor had been planted. By noon, the story had made its way through town, growing with each telling. By the time it reached the sheriff's office, Eli Granger was harboring a woman of ill repute out at his cabin. Sheriff Brody sighed and pushed his chair back from his desk. He was a man who preferred a quiet life, a life that involved overlooking certain things to maintain the peace. Unfortunately, peace in this county was largely owned and defined by one man, Asa Harwood. Brody owed his position and his continued health to Harwood's patronage. and Harwood did not like loose ends. He had been asking questions, quiet but insistent questions, about a girl who had run from his ranch a couple of weeks back, a girl who had struck him and vanished into a blizzard. The sheriff saddled his horse and rode out of town, a deep sense of foreboding settling in his gut. A visit to Eli Granger's homestead was never a pleasant task. The man was like a granite cliff. You could beat your fists against him all day, and the only thing that would break was you. When Sadie saw the horseman approaching, her blood ran cold. It was a man with a badge. Her first instinct was to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. She could only stand by the window, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and watch as he dismounted and strode to the door. Eli had seen him coming. He was standing on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest, waiting. "Granger," the sheriff said, stopping a few feet away. He kept his hand away from his gun, a deliberate gesture of non-aggression. "Just paying a social call." Eli said nothing. He just stood there, an immovable object blocking the doorway. "Heard some talk in town," Brody continued, his voice attempting a casual tone that didn't quite land. "Folks are saying you've got a visitor. A woman." Eli's expression didn't change. He didn't confirm or deny. He simply waited. "See, the thing is," the sheriff said, shifting his weight, "there's a girl missing. From the Harwood ranch. Mr. Harwood is concerned for her welfare." He peered past Eli, trying to get a look inside the cabin, but Eli's broad frame blocked the view completely. "I just need to ask her a few questions. Make sure she's all right." The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. The wind whistled through the pines. The sheriff's horse stamped its foot impatiently. "Inside." Sadie held her breath, convinced her heart would burst. Eli didn't speak. He didn't have to. His stance, his unwavering gaze, his absolute stillness said everything. It said, "This is my land. This is my home. You are not welcome here. Go away." Sheriff Brody was not a brave man, but he was a stubborn one. He held his ground for another long minute, the silent battle of wills playing out on the frozen porch. Finally, with a frustrated sigh, he gave up. He knew he couldn't force his way past Granger without a fight, and a fight with Eli was something he wanted to avoid at all costs. "All right, Granger," he muttered, turning away. "Have it your way, but Harwood ain't gonna let this go." He swung himself back into his saddle and rode off without a backward glance. The moment he was gone, the strength seemed to drain out of Sadie. She sank into the chair, trembling. It was happening again. She was bringing trouble. She was a curse, a plague that infected anyone who showed her a moment of kindness. She had brought the law to this man's door, and soon, she knew, something far worse than the law would follow. She couldn't stay. She couldn't be the reason his quiet life was torn apart, the reason those scars on his back were joined by new ones. That afternoon, while Eli was in the barn, she made her decision. She found the old, worn dress she had arrived in, folded neatly on a shelf. Her boots, which Eli had repaired and oiled, were by the door. She pulled them on, her movements clumsy with haste and fear. She had no idea where she would go, only that she had to leave. She scribbled a note on a piece of brown wrapping paper, a simple "thank you," and left it on the table. She opened the door and stepped out into the cold, bright air. She had only taken 3 steps when a voice behind her stopped her cold. "Where are you going?" It was Eli. He was standing at the corner of the cabin, holding a bridle. He must have seen her through the barn door. "I have to leave," she said, her voice shaking. She couldn't look at him. "He'll be back, the sheriff, or the other one. Harwood. I'm bringing trouble to you." She tried to walk past him, but he moved to block her path. "I won't be the reason you get hurt," she whispered, staring at the frozen ground. You saved me. I won't repay you by getting you killed." She tried to push past him again. a desperate, frantic energy coursing through her. He reached out and took her wrist. His grip wasn't harsh or bruising, but it was unyielding. It was the grip of a man who could bend iron but chose to be gentle. The warmth of his hand on her cold skin was a shock, a sudden, intimate connection that made her stop struggling. She looked up at him then, her eyes pleading. "Please, let me go!" He looked down at her, his dark eyes searching her face. The silence stretched between them, filled with the unspoken weight of her fear and his resolve. For the first time, she saw something in his expression beyond that stoic calm, a flicker of something fierce, protective. "You can stay," he said, his voice low and firm. It was not a question, it was a declaration. He let go of her wrist and turned, walking back toward the barn as if the matter was settled. Sadie stood frozen for a long moment, his words echoing in her mind. "You can stay." It was the simplest of phrases, yet it held a universe of meaning. It was an offer of sanctuary, a shield against the world, a choice. He was choosing to stand between her and whatever was coming. No one had ever done that for her before. That night, the emotional dam inside her finally broke. The fear, the gratitude, the confusion. It all swirled together into an overwhelming torrent. She knelt on the rug before the fire, not for warmth, but because her legs wouldn't hold her. She was staring into the flames, watching them dance and consume the wood. And she thought of how her life had been consumed by the whims and cruelties of others. Eli had given her a choice. He had given her a safe place. He was standing against the storm for her. A new, terrifying feeling was taking root in her heart, a fragile green shoot pushing up through scorched earth. It was trust. "I've never done this before," she whispered. The words spoken to the fire, to herself, to the silent man she knew was listening. She heard him move behind her. He walked past her slowly, his boots scuffing softly on the floorboards. He stopped in the middle of the room, his back to her. She watched his silhouette, a solid shape against the flickering light. Then, slowly, deliberately, he began to unbutton his shirt. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mind, conditioned by years of fending off unwanted advances, screamed in alarm. But his posture was not one of seduction. There was no lust in the air, no threat. There was only a heavy, somber gravity. He pulled the shirt from his shoulders, letting it fall to the floor. He turned, and in the warm, dancing firelight, he let her see. He let her see the scarred landscape of his back, the twisted, puckered skin that spoke of old fire and unimaginable pain. He stood before her, vulnerable and exposed, not in body, but in history. It was not a prelude to passion. It was an answer. It was his own confession, offered in the silent language he knew best. He was showing her his own brokenness, his own trauma. He was telling her, without a single word, that he understood. You are not alone in your pain. You are safe to be wounded here. The night Eli showed her his scars. Something shifted in the deep. Silent currents that ran between them. The boundary of fear, a line she had carefully maintained, began to dissolve. It was not gone, but it was no longer an impenetrable wall. In its place, a fragile and tentative trust began to sprout, a pale green shoot in a desolate landscape. Sadie began to move through the cabin not as a guest or a patient, but as a partner in their shared survival. The morning after his silent confession, she rose before him. When he came in from the barn, stamping the snow from his boots, a pot of coffee was already brewing over the fire, its rich aroma filling the small space. She had found a sack of flour and a tin of lard and was clumsily trying to mix biscuit dough in a wooden bowl. She looked up at him, a dusting of flour on her bruised cheek, her expression a mixture of defiance and hope. He simply nodded, took the bowl from her, and with his large, capable hands, expertly worked the dough, showing her without a word how to get the consistency right. That was how it started. A new routine bloomed in the quiet cabin, as peaceful and unspoken as their previous arrangement, but now threaded with a new kind of intimacy. She took it upon herself to mend his clothes. His work shirts were frayed at the cuffs, and his spare trousers had a tear at the knee. She found his small sewing kit and spent the afternoons by the fire, her stitches small and neat, a quiet act of care. She learned to cook their simple meals, and he taught her, through gesture and example, how to bake bread that rose properly and how to make a stew that would stick to their ribs. They moved around each other in a comfortable, silent dance. She would hand him a plate, and his fingers would brush hers. He would come in from the cold, and she would have a hot cup of coffee waiting. They were two solitary creatures who had, by some strange twist of fate, found a way to be alone together. The silence was no longer heavy with tension and uncertainty. It was a shared space, a comfortable blanket woven from mutual respect and a dawning, unspoken affection. She found herself watching his hands as he worked. Strong, gentle, scarred, and a warmth would spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. The outside world, with its threats and dangers, seemed to recede. The cabin became their entire universe, a fortress of quiet comfort against the harshness of the Wyoming winter. But the world does not forget, and fortresses, she knew, could always be breached. The breach came in the form of a young ranch hand named Jebediah, a boy with honest eyes and a perpetually worried expression. He rode up to the cabin one afternoon, leading a lame horse. Eli had a reputation for being good with animals, a skill that transcended his lack of sociability. Eli met him on the porch while Sadie watched from the window, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drum beat. The boy spoke in low, urgent tones, gesturing back toward the direction of the larger ranches to the south. Eli listened, his face impassive, his gaze fixed on the boy's face. After a few minutes of talk, Eli went to the barn and returned with a jar of liniment. He showed the boy how to apply it to the horse's leg, and the boy nodded gratefully. As Jebediah was preparing to leave, he cast a nervous glance toward the cabin window. He saw Sadie's silhouette and quickly looked away. He leaned in close to Eli, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Be careful, Mr. Granger," he said, his voice tight with anxiety. "He's been asking questions, Mr. Harwood. He's been asking every hand from here to Laramie about a runaway girl. Says she stole from him. He's offering a reward, a big one." Eli's expression didn't flicker. He simply stared at the boy until Jebediah shifted uncomfortably. I just thought you should know," the boy stammered. "You were good to my PA once." He tugged on the reins of his horse and left, his departure seeming more like a flight. Eli stood on the porch for a long time after the boy was gone, a solitary figure staring out at the vast, snow-covered plains. When he came back inside, the comfortable silence had vanished. The tension was back, a cold, sharp thing that pricked at the air. That night, the unspoken questions hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Sadie knew she could no longer keep her story locked away. The safety he had given her demanded the truth, no matter how ugly. She waited until he had finished his meal, until the fire had been banked for the night. He was sitting in his chair, staring into the flames, a habit of his that she had come to recognize as a form of deep thought. "My real name is Sadie," she began, her voice barely audible. "Sadie Whitmore." He turned his head slightly, his eyes still on the fire, but she knew he was listening with his entire being. "My father died a year ago, left my mother and 2 younger sisters with nothing but debt. We were losing our farm back in Ohio. A man, an acquaintance of my father's, arranged for me to come out here. He said there was a position, a companion for a wealthy rancher who had lost his wife." She let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. "A companion. I was so naive. I thought it meant reading to him, helping with his correspondence. I thought I could send money home, save my family." She paused, gathering her courage. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. making the small cabin feel vast and lonely. His name is Asa Harwood. From the moment I arrived at his ranch, I was a prisoner. He locked me in a set of rooms in his house. There were bars on the windows. He called me his songbird. He liked to watch me. He never forced himself on me in that way. But his eyes were always on me. His hands, he said that as long as I was good, as long as I pleased him, he would continue to send money to my mother. He showed me her letters. She wrote about how the money was helping, how they were able to buy seed for the spring planting. He told me if I ever tried to leave, the money would stop. And if I told anyone, he would send a letter saying I had died of a fever, and then he would do whatever he wanted with me. No one would ever know. Tears were streaming down her face now, hot and silent. She didn't bother to wipe them away. For 6 months, I was his bird in a gilded cage. I smiled. I sang the songs he liked. I let him touch my hair, and I died a little more each day. A few weeks ago, he was drunk, more than usual. He came into my room and he was different. He said he was tired of waiting. He tore my dress. Her voice broke. The memory, a physical thing, a hand closing around her throat. I don't know what happened. I just reacted. There was a fireplace poker. I grabbed it, and I hit him. I hit him hard, on the side of his head. He fell. There was so much blood. She was trembling violently now, her arms wrapped around herself as if to hold her splintering pieces together. I just ran. I took nothing. I climbed out a window and I ran into the night. I didn't know a storm was coming. I just ran until I couldn't run anymore. I think I might have killed him. Eli. The confession hung in the air, a terrible, damning weight. She had laid the ugliest parts of herself at his feet. She was a liar, a fugitive, and possibly a murderer. She waited for him to recoil, to turn on her with disgust and anger. He said nothing. He simply sat there, staring into the fire, the muscles in his jaw tight. He let her words settle, let her tears fall, let her brokenness fill the space between them. After a long, agonizing silence, he rose from his chair. He didn't look at her. He walked to the pegs above the door, took down his rifle, and sat back down. He laid the weapon across his lap and, with methodical, practiced movements, began to clean and oil it. Then he loaded it, the click of the cartridges sliding into the chamber unnervingly loud in the quiet room. He propped the rifle against the wall next to his chair and resumed his vigil, staring into the heart of the fire. He sat like that for hours, a silent, unmoving guardian, his decision made without a single word. As he stared into the flames, his own ghosts rose to meet him. The fire took him back to another time, another life, a life filled with laughter and the scent of lilacs. Her name was Annabelle. She was the town schoolteacher, with hair the color of corn silk and a smile that could make a man believe in heaven. They were to be married in the spring. He was adding a room onto the cabin, a room for children, his hands sure and his heart full of a hope so bright it was almost painful. Annabelle saw the good in everyone, a faith that Eli, even then, found naive. She believed in the law, in the inherent decency of people. She had run afoul of the Harwood family, Asa's father back then, a man cut from the same cruel cloth, a corrupt deputy, one of Harwood's kin, had been mistreating the children of the homesteaders, and Annabelle had threatened to report him to the territorial marshal. They had warned her to be quiet. Eli had warned her, but Annabelle believed in doing what was right. One Sunday morning, they were walking to the church. He was holding her hand. He remembered the feel of her fingers intertwined with his, the white lace on her dress brushing against his leg. The deputy stepped out from behind the blacksmith's shop. There were words, a cruel, sneering dismissal of her threats. Eli had stepped in front of her, a cold rage building in him, but he had been too slow. The gunshot was a deafening crack in the peaceful Sunday morning air. He hadn't even realized he was the target until he saw the look of shock on Annabelle's face as she pushed him aside. Her body taking the bullet meant for him. He remembered the blood. So much blood. A sudden, shocking crimson flower blooming on the pure white of her dress, spilling onto the church steps. He had held her as her life seeped away into the dusty ground. The law had done nothing. The deputy claimed it was an accident, that his gun had misfired. The Harwood family's money and influence ensured the matter was dropped. That was the day Eli Granger had died. He had buried his heart in the cold earth next to Annabelle's coffin and had become a man of silence and scars, living a half-life on the edge of a world he no longer trusted. He had lived that way ever since, until Sadie. Later that night, the sky broke open. A violent thunderstorm, unseasonable and savage, rolled in from the mountains. Thunder cracked like a whip, shaking the very foundations of the cabin. Lightning bleached the world white for a split second, followed by an immediate, deafening roar. Sadie woke with a scream caught in her throat. She was back in that room, the smell of whiskey and stale cigar smoke filling her nostrils. Harwood's face was looming over her, his eyes glazed with drink and possession, his hand tearing at her dress. The crack of thunder was the sound of the poker hitting his skull. She bolted upright, her heart a wild, panicked bird beating against her ribs. The nightmare clung to her like a shroud, real and suffocating. Sobbing, she scrambled out of the bed, driven by a primal need for safety, for protection. She didn't think, she just moved. She ran across the cold floorboards to where Eli slept, a dark shape in his chair by the dying fire. He was awake instantly, on his feet before she even reached him, his hand already on the rifle. "Eli!" she sobbed, her voice a ragged, desperate plea. She didn't stop. She ran right into him, her arms wrapping around his waist, her face burying itself in the rough fabric of his shirt. She clung to him, shaking, the terror of the dream indistinguishable from the terror of her life. For a moment, he was rigid, his body tense with surprise. Then, slowly, his arms came around her. One hand rested on the small of her back, the other gently cradled the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. He held her, absorbing the force of her sobs, a solid, unmoving anchor in her storm-tossed world. She cried until she had no tears left, her body shuddering with the aftermath. The thunder rolled outside, a distant echo of the tempest inside her. She slowly became aware of his heartbeat, a steady, rhythmic thud beneath her ear. She could feel the warmth of his body, the solid strength of the arms that held her. She tilted her head back to look at him. In the fleeting, stark light of a lightning flash, she saw his face. The usual impassive mask was gone. In his eyes, she saw a reflection of her own pain, a deep, soul-shattering grief. He was looking at her as if he was seeing not just a frightened woman, but a kindred spirit, another soul who had been scarred by the world's cruelty. The space between them crackled with an energy more potent than the storm. It was a fragile, terrifying thing, this feeling, a desperate need to connect, to find solace in another's arms. He lowered his head, his movements hesitant, almost uncertain. His gaze dropped to her lips. It was a terrified question. She gave him her answer by rising slightly on her toes, closing the small distance between them. Their first kiss was not one of passion or of practiced seduction. It was a tentative, trembling press of lips, as hesitant and fragile as the trust they had built. It was the taste of salt from her tears and the scent of wood smoke from his skin. It was two broken people, in the storm-lit darkness, afraid to want something so beautiful, so fragile, so easily destroyed, but wanting it all the same. The world began to weep. The great silent shroud of winter, which had held the plains in a frozen, breathless grip, started to relent. The first sign was the sound of dripping water from the eaves of the cabin, a gentle, persistent rhythm like a slow-beating heart. Then came the smell of damp earth, a scent so rich and full of life it felt like a promise. Patches of dark, muddy ground appeared in the brilliant white landscape, growing larger each day. as if the land itself were taking a deep breath after a long sleep. The thaw mirrored the change within the cabin walls, a slow, messy, and undeniable melting of the ice that had encased two solitary hearts. With the changing season came a change in Sadie. The fear that had kept her small and quiet began to recede, replaced by a tentative, flickering resolve. She was no longer just a survivor. She wanted to be a fighter. It began with a question, spoken softly one morning as Eli cleaned his Colt revolver at the table. "Could you teach me?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the weapon. "To shoot." Eli looked up, his hands still. He studied her face, searching for the reason behind the request. He saw not aggression or a thirst for vengeance, but a deep-seated need to never be helpless again. He gave a single, slow nod. Her first lesson was a lesson in respect for the weapon. He showed her how to hold it, how to check the chamber, how to feel its weight and balance. His hands would cover hers, adjusting her grip, his touch firm and impersonal. Yet the proximity sent a shiver through her. He set up empty tin cans on a fence post 50 feet from the cabin. The first time she fired the pistol, the noise was a deafening explosion, and the kick sent a jarring shock up her arm, nearly knocking her off balance. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt 10 feet to the left of the target. "Again," was all he said. Day after day, they practiced. He taught her how to stand, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger gently instead of jerking it. He was a patient teacher, his instructions sparse but precise. "Don't fight it," he'd say, his voice low. "Become part of it." Slowly, her fear of the weapon turned into a focused concentration. Then came the satisfying ping of a bullet hitting tin. A small, triumphant smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile he had ever seen from her. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows. He found himself staring for a moment too long before turning away to set up another can. He also taught her to ride. She knew the basics, but he taught her the way of the plains, how to move with the horse, to feel its rhythm, to guide it with a gentle pressure of the knees rather than a hard pull on the reins. He put her on Jed, his own steady buckskin, and led her around the small corral he had built. Sometimes, when she lost her balance, his hand would shoot out to steady her, his palm resting on the small of her back. The touch was brief, practical, but it sent a wave of warmth through her that lingered long after he had let go. These lessons, held in the vast, open silence of the thawing plains, brought them closer than words ever could. They were building a new language together, one of physical trust and shared purpose. "One morning," he announced, "we need supplies." It wasn't a question. He saddled Jed for himself and a gentle mare for her. The unspoken message was clear. She was coming with him. The thought sent a spike of fear through her, but a stronger feeling followed it, a refusal to hide. She put on the dress made from the blue wool he had bought for her, her hands steady as she fastened the buttons. Riding into town beside him felt like a declaration. It was received as one. As they rode down the muddy main street, a hush fell over the town. Conversations on the boardwalk ceased. Faces appeared in the windows of the mercantile and the saloon. The stares were a physical weight, a barrage of curiosity, suspicion, and condemnation. Sadie kept her eyes fixed forward, her back straight in the saddle, but she could feel the heat of 100 judgments on her skin. Inside Abernathy's mercantile, the air was thick with suffocating silence. Eli handed his list to the shopkeeper, his presence as solid and unyielding as a mountain. Sadie stood near him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, trying to make herself as small as possible. It was then that she heard it, a sibilant whisper, sharp and venomous, from a woman in a severe black bonnet standing near the fabric aisle. It was the pastor's wife, Mrs. Gable. "Look at her," she hissed to her companion, her voice dripping with righteous piety. "Barely more than a girl. He keeps her out there, alone with him. She's ruined, utterly ruined, The word hit Sadie with the force of a physical blow. Ruined. It was the brand they had tried to put on her at the saloon, the label she had run from her whole life. To hear it now, in this place of supposed decency, broke something inside her. She felt the blood drain from her face. The room seemed to tilt, the staring faces blurring into a hateful collage. She turned and fled, stumbling out of the store and into the muddy street, gasping for air that felt suddenly too thin to breathe. Eli was beside her a moment later. He didn't speak, just took the reins from her trembling hands, finished his business, and led their horses to the edge of town. They rode back to the cabin in a silence that was once again heavy and painful. That evening, the storm inside her finally broke. She sat by the fire, the untouched plate of food on her lap, the pastor's wife's words echoing in her mind. Eli watched her from his chair, his expression unreadable. "Are you ashamed of me?" she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "To be seen with me?" It was the ultimate question, the raw, bleeding heart of her fear. She was damaged goods. She was trouble. She was a ruined woman, and she was tied to him. She expected him to hesitate, to offer a kind but evasive answer. Instead, he leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees, and looked her directly in the eye. His gaze was so intense it felt as if he were seeing straight through to her soul. "You don't need to pretend you're not afraid of them," he said, his voice quiet but resonant with a strange power. "Just stay near me." It wasn't a denial of the world's cruelty. It was an acceptance of it. He wasn't promising the whispers would stop. He wasn't telling her to be brave. He was acknowledging her fear, validating it, and offering the only shield he possessed, himself. He was telling her that she didn't have to face the world alone. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She nodded, unable to speak. News of the confrontation in the mercantile spread through the small community, but it did not have the effect Mrs. Gable had intended. The following Sunday, during the pastor's sermon on the virtues of charity and forgiveness, a lone figure stood up in the back of the church. It was the widow Miller, the woman Eli had delivered supplies to at the start of the winter. "Pastor," she said, her voice wavering but clear in the hushed sanctuary, "you speak of charity. I would like to speak of a man who lives it." She looked directly at Mrs. Gable. "Eli Granger may not sit in these pews, but when my husband passed and I was snowed in with no wood for my fire, he was the one who came. He asked for nothing. He said nothing. He just did what was right. If that man has taken in a soul in need, it is not for us to cast stones. It is for us to wonder if we would have had the Christian courage to do the same." She sat down. A wave of murmurs rippled through the congregation. The pastor, flustered, cleared his throat and continued his sermon, but the seed of doubt had been planted. For the first time, a voice in the town had spoken for Eli Granger, and by extension, for the woman he protected. A subtle but important shift had begun. That night, the air in the cabin was different. The shared ordeal in town, and Eli's unwavering support, had forged a new, deeper layer of their bond. They sat by the fire, the silence comfortable once more. Sadie was patching one of Eli's shirts, her hands busy, her mind calm. She felt him watching her and looked up. The look on his face was one she had never seen before. The guards were down. The wall of silence and grief had a breach in it, and what she saw in his eyes was a raw, aching vulnerability. "Her name was Annabelle," he said, his voice rough, as if the words themselves were stones he had to force up from his throat. Sadie put down her sewing. Her heart stood still. He told her everything. He spoke of the schoolteacher with hair like corn silk, of their plans to marry, of the room he was building for children they would never have. He told her about the elder Harwood, about the corrupt deputy, and about Annabelle's unshakable belief in doing what was right. And then he told her the part he had never spoken aloud to another living soul. "She saw him draw his gun," Eli said, his voice hollow, his eyes fixed on a past only he could see. "He was aiming for me. I was too slow. She pushed me. She took the bullet meant for me." He finally looked at Sadie, and his eyes were filled with a guilt so profound it was like a physical wound. "I buried her, but I have been living in that grave ever since." He had opened himself up completely, offering her the broken, bleeding core of his soul. He had shared the source of his scars, the ghost that haunted his silence. Sadie listened without speaking, without judgment. She absorbed his pain, his guilt, his loss. When he was finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. He had given her his truth, and now she would give him hers. She rose from her chair and knelt before him. She took his large, calloused hands in hers. They were trembling, or maybe it was her own hands that shook. She looked into his eyes, and she saw not a hardened gunman or a silent loner, but a man drowning in a grief she understood all too well. Slowly, she let go of his hands and lifted her own to the laces at the front of her dress. Her fingers worked at the knot, her gaze never leaving his. He watched her, his breath caught in his chest, his expression a mixture of confusion, hope, and fear. She pulled the laces free, the dress loosened, parting to reveal the simple chemise beneath. "I've never done this before," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. And he understood. She didn't mean the physical act. She meant the choice. She meant the giving of herself, freely and wholly, without fear, without coercion, without a price. It was her first time choosing. He reached out, his hand shaking, and cupped her cheek. His thumb gently stroked her skin. The tenderness in his touch was an answer, a question, and a prayer all at once. Their coming together was as tender and as trembling as their first kiss. It was not a storm of passion or a fever of lust. It was a quiet, desperate act of healing. It was two wounded souls finding a sanctuary in each other's arms. It was the feel of his scarred skin against hers, a testament to survival. It was the slow, deliberate exploration of two people who had been starved of gentle touch, of simple affection. They moved with a reverence, a fear of breaking something so incredibly fragile. It was a final, silent confession. "I choose you, despite the pain, despite the shame, despite the fear of what was to come. I choose you." The next morning, Sadie woke to the feeling of sunlight on her face. She was wrapped in Eli's arms, her head resting on his chest, his heartbeat a slow, steady rhythm beneath her ear. For the first time since she had fled Ohio, she felt utterly, completely safe. She lay there, listening to his breathing, watching the dust motes dance in the sunbeams slanting through the window. He stirred, and his arm tightened around her. She tilted her head back to look at him. His eyes were open, watching her with a quiet intensity that made her heart ache. He lifted a hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. His eyes held a new light, a fierce, protective fire she had only glimpsed before. "If anyone comes for you," he said, his voice low and absolute, a vow spoken into the quiet morning air, "they'll answer to me." The fragile peace was a fleeting thing, a thin sheet of ice over a raging river, and it was shattered by the return of Asa Harwood. He did not come himself, not at first. His presence was a poison that seeped back into the community, carried on whispers and fearful glances. Jebediah, the young ranch hand, was the one who brought the news, riding his horse hard and arriving at the cabin at dusk, his face pale with dread. "He's back, Mr. Granger," the boy said, his voice tight as he twisted the reins in his hands. "He was laid up in Cheyenne for weeks. The poker, it cracked his skull. Doctors thought he was a goner, but he's back, and he's changed." Eli stood on the porch, a still, dark silhouette against the fading light. "How?" "He's meaner," Jebediah whispered, as if the man himself might hear. "Quieter, but the look in his eyes, it's like a banked fire. He walks with a cane now, and a limp. He doesn't shout like he used to. It's worse. Somehow, he just looks at you, and you feel cold all the way to your bones. He's been with the sheriff all day." Eli thanked the boy and sent him on his way. He came back inside and looked at Sadie. Her face was ashen. The ghost she had thought vanquished had risen, wounded and furious. Her desperate act of self-defense had not freed her. It had only enraged her captor. 2 days later, Sheriff Brody rode out to the cabin again. This time, he did not come alone. He had 2 deputies with him, nervous men who kept their hands close to their pistols and their eyes on Eli. "Granger," Brody said, his voice strained and official. He held up a piece of paper. "I have a warrant for the arrest of one Sadie Whitmore on charges of theft and attempted murder, filed by Mr. Asa Harwood." Sadie, who had been standing in the doorway, felt the floor drop out from under her. The lie was so monstrous, so complete, that it stole her breath. Eli didn't even look at the paper. His eyes were fixed on the sheriff's face, a look of profound contempt in their dark depths. "You know that's a lie, Brody." "I know what the paper says," the sheriff retorted, his face flushing. "And it's signed by a judge. Now, I'm asking you to step aside and let us take the woman." Eli didn't move. "You're not taking anyone." "Don't make this difficult." "Eli," Brody pleaded, his official tone cracking. "He'll ruin me. He'll ruin this whole town. Just give her up." The request, so craven and weak, seemed to solidify something in Eli. He stepped off the porch and walked slowly toward the sheriff's horse. He held out his hand. "Let me see it." Reluctantly, Sheriff Brody handed him the warrant. Eli took the paper. His eyes scanned the formal, looping script that spelled out a fiction designed to destroy a woman he had sworn to protect. The town, the law, the entire world seemed to be conspiring to crush this one fragile life. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the deputies, and then landing once more on the sheriff. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he tore the paper in half, and then in half again. He let the pieces flutter from his fingers and settle in the mud. A collective gasp went through the deputies. Sheriff Brody's face went white. "This paper is a lie," Eli said, his voice low and carrying with deadly clarity. "And you're a coward for serving it. You get on your horses and you ride back to the man who bought your badge. You tell him that Sadie Whitmore is under my protection. You tell him the only outlaw here is him. And you tell him if he wants her, he can come and get her himself." For a long moment, no one moved. The deputies looked at the sheriff, who looked at the torn paper in the mud, then at the unyielding figure of Eli Granger. There would be a gunfight if he pushed it. He knew that. And he knew, with a sinking certainty, that he and his men would lose. "You've made a terrible mistake, Granger," Brody said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. He wheeled his horse around and, with his deputies trailing anxiously behind him, galloped back toward town. The act of defiance, as public as it was, split the town like a wedge driven into a log. Tensions, which had been simmering beneath the surface, now rose into the open. Some of the townsfolk, those who had long chafed under the Harwood family's thumb, saw Eli's stand as an act of heroism. Silas Croft, the blacksmith, a huge, mournful man whose son had been lynched years ago on Harwood's orders over a disputed cattle claim, gave Eli a grim, approving nod the next time he saw him. The widow Miller and a few of the other homesteading families began leaving small gifts of eggs or bread on a stump at the edge of Eli's property, silent offerings of support. But many more were afraid. Fear was a currency Asa Harwood had always traded in, and he was a wealthy man. Mr. Abernathy, the mercantile owner, now refused to meet Eli's eye, hurrying his orders and avoiding all conversation. Men who once would have shared a drink with him now crossed the street to avoid him. They saw him not as a protector, but as a lightning rod, a man who was drawing the fury of a vengeful god down upon them all. The whispers that followed Sadie were now laced with a new element, fear. She was the woman who would get them all killed. Harwood did not wait long to retaliate. His brand of justice was swift, brutal, and aimed at the heart of a man's life. It happened a few nights later. They were jolted from sleep by a frantic whinnying from the barn. A hellish orange light was flickering against the cabin window. Eli was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his trousers and grabbing his rifle. "Stay here," he commanded. But one look at the inferno that had been his barn told him he would need her help. The fire was a roaring, hungry beast, consuming the dry timbers with a terrifying speed. The heat was a physical blow, and the air was thick with choking, black smoke. Inside, the terrified screams of the horses were a sound of pure agony. "The horses!" Eli yelled over the roar of the flames. "Get the trough! We need water!" There was no time for a plan, only for action. He soaked a blanket in the water trough and threw it over his head, then charged into the burning barn. The heat was searing, and a falling beam crashed down just feet from where he entered. He could see the two horses, their eyes wide with terror, rearing and kicking in their stalls. Sadie worked with a frantic, desperate energy she didn't know she possessed. She filled buckets from the trough, her lungs burning, her eyes streaming from the smoke. She ran back and forth, throwing the pitifully small amounts of water at the base of the flames near the stall doors. Eli emerged from the inferno, leading a terrified Jed, whose coat was singed and smoking. He slapped the horse's flank, sending him galloping into the night. Away from the fire, he turned to go back in for the mare. "Eli, no!" Sadie screamed, grabbing his arm. "It's going to collapse!" He shook her off. "I'm not leaving her." He plunged back into the smoke and flames. Seconds later, the main roof beam gave way with a groaning crack, sending a shower of sparks and burning timbers down into the heart of the barn. The structure imploded, collapsing in on itself in a fiery, final roar. Sadie screamed his name, convinced she had just watched him die. Then, a figure stumbled out of the smoke from a side door. Half leading, half carrying the badly burned and panicked mare, it was Eli. His shirt was gone, his hair was singed, and a fresh, angry red burn was blistering across his shoulder. But he was alive. He got the horse clear just as the last of the walls fell in. They stood there for a long time, watching the fire consume what was left of his barn, the heat washing over their smoke-stained faces. The mare, trembling, stood nearby. Jed cautiously trotted back, drawn by the presence of his master. They had saved the animals, but the cost was written in the smoldering ruins. Sadie was coughing, her throat raw, her body shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. She looked at the ashes, at the man standing beside her, at the long, hard road that had led her to this night of fire and terror. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was only the beginning. Harwood would not stop with a barn. He would burn down the whole world to get what he wanted. She looked at Eli, her eyes reflecting the dying flames. "He won't stop," she whispered, her voice a harsh rasp. "We have to end this." Eli looked from the ashes of his barn to her determined, smoke-smudged face. He saw not a victim, but a survivor, a fighter. He gave a single grim nod. The next day, Eli began to gather his allies. This would not be a fight he could win alone. He rode out first to the blacksmith's forge. He found Silas Croft hammering a piece of glowing red iron into a horseshoe, his massive arms slick with sweat. He didn't need to say much. "Harwood burned my barn last night," Eli said, his voice flat. Silas stopped hammering. He plunged the hot iron into a quenching tub, a furious hiss of steam filling the air. He turned, and in his eyes, Eli saw a grief that had festered for a decade. "My boy was a good boy," Silas said, his voice a low rumble of pain. "Harwood's men strung him up for sport. The law called it an accident." He picked up the heavy blacksmith's hammer, his knuckles white. "You tell me when and where." Next, he sought out 2 former Union soldiers who lived on a small, hard-scrabble homestead north of town. They were quiet, grim men who had seen the worst of humanity at places like Antietam and Gettysburg. They had little love for bullies, and even less for corrupt officials. They listened to his story, their faces hard and unreadable. When he was done, one of them, a man with a scarred face named Caleb, simply spat a wad of tobacco into the dust. "A man's got a right to defend his home," Caleb said. "And a man's got a right to protect his own. We're with you." His final visit was to a man who lived deep in the foothills, a man who knew the land better than any surveyor. He was a Lakota tracker known as Kills the Night, a man who owed Eli a debt. Years ago, Eli had tracked the man's young daughter for 2 days after she had wandered off in a storm, finding her cold but alive, and returning her and her lost medicine pouch to her family. Eli found him tanning a deer hide outside his lodge. He explained the situation, the looming fight with Harwood. Kills the Night listened without interruption. When Eli was finished, the tracker pointed to the south. "Harwood's cattle poison the water. His men kill the buffalo for fun. He is a man with a hollow spirit. When the time comes, I will know. I will be there." While Eli prepared for a war of bullets and blood, Sadie prepared in her own way. She knew there was a very real chance she would not survive the coming confrontation. There was one last debt she had to pay, one final truth she had to tell. She sat at the small table with a pen and a piece of paper Eli had bought for her and wrote a long letter to her mother in Ohio. She told her everything, the truth about Harwood's proposition, the gilded cage, the threats, the escape, the poker, and she told her about Eli. She wrote of his quiet kindness, of his scars, of the way he made her feel safe. She told her mother not to grieve for her, but to know that for a short time in this wild and unforgiving place, she had finally found a man of honor, and she had known a kind of love she never thought possible. She sealed the letter and rode into town, avoiding the main street. She went to the widow Miller's small house on the edge of town. She gave the woman the letter. If anything happens to me," Sadie said, her voice trembling slightly, "will you see that this gets mailed?" The widow's eyes, full of a sad wisdom, met hers. She took the letter and placed a gentle, wrinkled hand on Sadie's arm. "You are a brave girl," she said softly, "and he is a good man. May God watch over you both." That night, the air in the cabin was charged with the weight of what was to come. The future had shrunk to a single point, a violent confrontation that lay just beyond the next sunrise. Death was a palpable presence in the room, a cold shadow in the corners. They didn't speak of it, but the knowledge was in their every glance, every touch, after their simple meal. Eli stood by the window, staring out into the darkness where his barn used to be. Sadie came and stood behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and pressing her cheek against his scarred back. He covered her hands with his. They stood like that for a long time, drawing strength from each other. The coming battle had stripped away all pretense, all hesitation. There was only now, this one night. He turned in her arms and looked down at her. His eyes were dark with a fierce, desperate emotion. He lowered his head and kissed her, and this time, there was no gentle exploration, no tender hesitation. It was the kiss of a man on the edge of a precipice, a frantic claiming. Their love-making was as urgent and as raw as the coming dawn. It was a desperate, silent promise to live, a furious affirmation of life in the face of death. It was the urgency of two people trying to memorize each other, to burn the feel of each other's skin into their memory in case memories were all they had left. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking act of defiance, a whispered shout into the uncaring darkness. "We are here, we are alive, and we will not be erased." They clung to each other as if the world was ending, knowing that in the morning, it very well might. The dawn broke cold and clear, a sliver of pale, merciless light on the eastern horizon. There was no bird song. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Eli stood at the edge of his field, the muddy, thawing ground firm beneath his boots. The air was still and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Beside him stood Silas Croft, The blacksmith, his heavy hammer resting on his shoulder, his face a mask of grim resolve. A few yards back, hidden in a thicket of aspen, Caleb and the other former soldier checked their rifles, their movement spare and efficient, somewhere, unseen in the trees. Kills the Night was watching, a ghost in the morning twilight. Sadie stood on the porch of the cabin, a rifle held in her hands. It was lighter than Eli's, a Winchester carbine he had given her. The stock was smooth and cool against her cheek. She was not a trembling girl hiding from the world anymore. She was a woman defending her home. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her belly, but her hands were steady. They did not have to wait long. They appeared as silhouettes against the rising sun, a dark line of horsemen cresting the low ridge to the south. There were more than a dozen of them, riding with the easy arrogance of men who believed in their own numbers and the power of the man who led them. Asa Harwood rode at their head. He sat tall in a fine leather saddle, a long duster covering his frame, even from a distance. Sadie could see the unnatural stiffness in his posture, the slight favor he gave to one leg. They rode forward until they were 100 feet from Eli and Silas, then reined in their horses. The silence was absolute, a stretched, vibrating wire of tension. Asa Harwood's voice cut through the stillness, cold and devoid of emotion. "Granger, I've come for what is mine." "She's not a piece of property, Harwood," Eli called back, his voice calm and even, carrying easily in the thin air. "She's a free woman. You have no claim on her." A humorless smile touched Harwood's lips. He gestured with his chin toward the men flanking him. "I have 12 claims right here, and a warrant from the law you seem so fond of ignoring. This can be simple. Send out the girl, and you and your blacksmith friend can live to see another sunset." "The only way you're taking her," Silas Croft rumbled, his voice like grinding stone, "is over my dead body." "That can be arranged," Harwood said smoothly. He looked past them, his eyes fixing on the cabin, on the small figure of Sadie standing on the porch. His gaze was possessive, the look of a collector appraising an object that had been briefly misplaced. "Sadie, my songbird, you have caused a great deal of trouble. Come out now. Don't make me tear this hovel apart to get to you." Sadie's knuckles were white on the rifle. The sound of his voice, the hateful pet name, sent a wave of nausea through her. But she did not flinch. She raised the rifle, its barrel pointing toward the line of men. It was an act of pure defiance. Harwood's cold smile vanished. His face contorted in a mask of rage. "So be it," he snarled, and his hand dropped toward the pistol at his hip. The world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. The first shot came not from Harwood, but from the trees. One of Harwood's men screamed and tumbled from his saddle, a feathered arrow protruding from his throat. The shot from Kills the Night was the signal. Caleb and his companion opened fire from the aspen grove, their rifles cracking in unison. 2 more of Harwood's riders fell. The fight dissolved into chaos. It was not the clean, heroic ballet of dime novels. It was a messy, brutal, and terrifying business. Horses screamed and reared, their riders fighting for control as bullets whizzed through the air. Gunsmoke filled the field, a thick, acrid fog that stung the eyes and throat. Eli and Silas took cover behind a low stone wall that bordered the field. They fired with a grim efficiency, not wasting shots, aiming for the men, not the horses. Silas's heavy buffalo gun boomed, its report echoing off the mountains, each shot punching a man from his saddle. Sadie, from the porch, fired the carbine. She did not aim to kill. She aimed for the ground in front of the horses, for the saddlebags, for anything that would disrupt and distract. Her shots were a part of the defense, a statement that the cabin itself was fighting back. A bullet struck the stone wall near Eli's head, sending rock fragments stinging into his cheek. He ignored it, firing back, taking down another rider. But Harwood's men were recovering from the initial ambush. They were hired guns, hard men, and they spread out, using their horses for cover. returning fire with a vengeance. Silas grunted in pain. Stumbling back, a dark stain was spreading across his thigh. "I'm hit," he growled, more angry than hurt. He tore a strip from his shirt and began tying a crude tourniquet. Eli saw the shift in the fight. They were outnumbered. A few of Harwood's men were dismounting, trying to flank them, to get a clear shot at the men in the aspen grove. He knew this would not be won by attrition. It would be won by taking out the head of the snake. He looked for Harwood. The rancher had taken cover behind his horse, firing his pistol toward the cabin, his movement stiff and awkward due to his injury. His face was a mask of pure hatred, his rage directed entirely at Sadie. Eli saw his chance. He rose from behind the wall, his own pistol in hand, and took a steady aim. At that exact moment, two of Harwood's men charged the wall from the side. Eli was forced to turn, firing twice, dropping both men in the mud, but the movement had exposed him. Sadie saw it all happen as if in slow motion. Harwood, seeing Eli distracted, stepped out from behind his horse. He raised his pistol, not at Eli, but at her. His intent was clear. He would kill the prize he could not possess. "Sadie!" Eli yelled, turning, realizing his mistake. He threw himself sideways, putting his body directly in the path of Harwood's aim, a human shield. The world seemed to contract to the space between them. The roar of the gunfight faded to a dull hum. There was the flash from Harwood's gun, the crack of the shot, and the sickening thud of the bullet striking flesh. Eli cried out, a sharp, ragged sound, as he was spun around, his left shoulder erupting in a spray of red. He staggered but did not fall, his eyes still fixed on Sadie, his one goal to protect her. Harwood smiled, a truly terrible sight, and began to cock his pistol for a second shot, this one aimed at Eli's head. But in that split second, something inside Sadie broke free. The fear, the doubt, the years of feeling helpless. It all burned away, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. She raised the carbine, the sights finding their target. She remembered Eli's words. Don't fight it. Become part of it. She took a breath, held it, and gently squeezed the trigger. The carbine bucked against her shoulder. Harwood screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain, and his leg crumpled beneath him. His pistol discharged harmlessly into the sky as he fell to the ground, clutching his shattered kneecap. The fight was not over. Eli, ignoring the fire in his shoulder, charged forward. He kicked the pistol from Harwood's grasp and loomed over the man, his face a thunderous mask of rage. He raised his own pistol, the barrel aimed squarely between Harwood's terrified eyes. This was the moment he had unknowingly waited for since Annabelle's death, the moment to take back what was stolen from him, to deliver the justice the law had denied. Revenge was a simple, clean, and satisfying pull of the trigger away. He saw Annabelle's face, the blood on the church steps, the long, empty years that followed. And then he saw Sadie's face. He saw the trust in her eyes, the gentle way she had tended his scars, the life they had begun to build in the ashes of his past. He looked down at the pathetic, wounded man at his feet. Killing him would be an act of the past. Sparing him, letting the law handle him, was an act of the future. He lowered the gun. He chose justice. Just then, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and a posse of riders appeared, led by a pale-faced Sheriff Brody. The remaining hired guns, seeing their leader down and the law arriving, threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. The town had finally found its courage. The sound of the sustained gunfight and the impassioned pleas of the widow Miller, who had gone from house to house, had finally pushed them past their fear. They had forced the sheriff to act. Brody dismounted, his eyes taking in the scene, the wounded men, the dead, the defeated ranch baron, and Eli Granger standing over him, blood pouring from his shoulder. He looked at Sadie on the porch, still holding the rifle, her face streaked with smoke and tears. "Asa Harwood," the sheriff said. his voice finding a strength he didn't know he possessed. "You are under arrest for assault, attempted murder, and arson." As his deputies hauled a screaming, cursing Harwood to his feet, the strength that had held Eli up finally gave way. The world began to swim, the edges of his vision turning gray. The adrenaline faded, and the white-hot pain in his shoulder consumed him. He collapsed to his knees, his pistol falling from his numb fingers. Sadie ran. She flew from the porch, across the muddy, blood-soaked field, and fell to her knees beside him. She cradled his head in her lap, her hands frantically trying to staunch the bleeding from his shoulder. "Eli," she sobbed, her tears falling onto his face. "Stay with me." He looked up at her, his eyes struggling to focus. He managed a faint, pained smile. At that moment, a single, fat snowflake drifted down from the gray sky, landing on his cheek and melting against his skin, then another and another. A gentle, quiet snow had begun to fall, a soft, white blanket to cover the violence and the blood. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion as she held him tight. "Let me save you now." Weeks passed. The snow fell, and then it melted, giving way to the true, green promise of spring in the quiet of the cabin. Sadie nursed Eli back to health. The bullet had gone clean through, but the blood loss had nearly killed him. She cleaned and dressed the wound daily, fed him broth, and sat by his side, reading to him from the worn Bible she had found. In those long, quiet days, their bond deepened into something unbreakable, forged in fire and sealed in the silent language of care. The town, in the aftermath of the gunfight, was a changed place. Asa Harwood was gone, taken to the territorial prison to await trial, with his corrupting influence removed. The community began to heal. The shame of their long-held fear gave way to a quiet respect for the man and woman who had refused to break. One afternoon, there was a knock at the door. It was the pastor's wife, Mrs. Gable, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. She stood twisting her gloves in her hands, a picture of misery. "Mrs. Whitmore," she began, her voice trembling. I have come to beg your forgiveness. The things I said, the way I judged you, it was a wicked and unchristian thing to do. I was a fool, blinded by pride. Can you ever forgive me?" She broke down in tears, a storm of pent-up guilt and shame. Sadie looked at the woman, and she felt not anger, but a strange, sad pity. She thought of the whispers, the stares, the word ruined, and then she thought of Eli's quiet strength, of the home she had found. She had nothing left to fear from words. "There is nothing to forgive," Sadie said, her voice soft but firm. "You did not know me then, and I am not the same woman now." The apology, and Sadie's quiet grace in accepting it, was the final turning of the tide. She was no longer the outsider, the Scarlet Woman. She was one of them. She was the woman who had stood with Eli Granger. As Eli's strength returned, he began to work, with the help of Silas Croft, who now walked with a proud limp, and Caleb. He cleared the ashes of his old barn. And then he began to build. He did not rebuild the barn. Instead, next to the cabin, he laid a new foundation. He felled trees and hewed logs. And slowly, a second room began to take shape, attached to the first, its window facing the rising sun. He was building for the future. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long purple shadows from the mountains, Sadie stood on the porch. The air was warm, and the scent of new grass and wildflowers filled the air. She was barefoot, the rough, familiar wood of the porch cool beneath her feet. She watched the sky bleed from orange to pink to deep violet, a sense of peace settling over her so profound it felt like a dream. She heard him come up behind her. He didn't speak. His strong arms wrapped around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, and they watched the last of the light fade together. His body was warm and solid behind her, a living wall against the vast emptiness of the world. She leaned her head back against him, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "I've never felt like I belonged anywhere," she whispered, the words a confession spoken to the twilight. Until now. He held her tighter, his embrace a silent answer. She felt him press a kiss to her temple, and this time, in the quiet of the evening, Eli Granger spoke first. "You belong here," he said, his voice a low, certain rumble against her ear. "You belong to me." Thank you for being part of our story tonight. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from to connect with fellow fans. And be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.